You haven't stopped moving in years. And if someone asked you why, you'd probably say you're driven, ambitious, that you have goals, that there's a lot to do and not enough time to do it. But I want to offer you a different explanation. One that's harder to hear, but more honest. What if the busyness isn't about ambition at all? What if the reason you can't slow down, the reason a free afternoon feels uncomfortable, the reason silence makes you reach for your phone, the reason rest never actually feels like rest, isn't discipline? What if it's fear? Not fear of failing, not fear of falling behind. Something older than that. Something that was wired into you long before you had a to-do list or a career or a calendar full of obligations. That's what this video is about. Not productivity hacks, not morning routines, not the 5 habits of the world's most successful people. We're going somewhere those conversations never go. Underneath the behavior, into the psychology that's driving it. Because here's the thing, you can optimize forever. You can get more efficient, more strategic, more disciplined. And it won't fix this, because you can't out-organize a wound. There's a network in your brain that activates when you're not focused on a task. Neuroscientists call it the default mode network. And despite the name, there's nothing passive about it. When it turns on, when there's no external demand pulling your attention, it starts to process. It replays memories. It runs emotional simulations. It surfaces unresolved material. Questions you haven't answered. Feelings you haven't finished feeling. Truths about yourself and your life that you've been too busy to sit with. Busyness suppresses this. Not permanently, not completely, but effectively enough that a person who stays occupied enough for long enough can go years without ever encountering what's living in that quiet. And this matters because that material doesn't disappear just because you ignore it. It accumulates. It finds other exits. It shows up as anxiety that arrives without a clear cause, as a persistent, low-level dissatisfaction that survives every achievement, as a restlessness that makes you feel guilty for resting, itchy when you're idle, vaguely wrong when there's nothing demanding your attention. You've felt this. Most people watching this have felt this. The free Sunday that should feel good, but doesn't. The vacation where you couldn't stop checking your phone. The moment the work paused, and instead of relief, what arrived was something closer to dread. That's not a productivity problem. That's your nervous system telling you that stillness isn't safe. The question is, what taught it that? Carl Jung called it the shadow, the part of the self that carries everything a person learned, usually early, usually without words, was unacceptable. Not just the dark impulses, the jealousy or the rage that polite society asks you to suppress. The shadow holds bigger things than that. It holds unlived potential, buried desires. And for a lot of high-achieving people, it holds something specific. The belief that you don't have the right to exist without earning it. Think about what most driven people absorbed growing up. The message wasn't always harsh. It often came from loving homes. But the structure of it said, attention comes when you perform. Approval arrives when you're useful. You matter when you produce something that matters. So you produced. You worked. You achieved. And it worked. In the sense that the approval came, the attention came, the sense of being valued came. Conditional on output. Consistent enough to reinforce the equation. And now you're an adult, with a career, with goals, with a schedule that leaves very little space for stillness. And somewhere underneath all of it, the equation is still running. If I stop, something is withdrawn. That's not ambition. That's a nervous system that learned, a long time ago, that rest is a risk. Here's where I want to be precise, because this is the part that gets misread. I'm not arguing against hard work. I'm not saying ambition is pathological, or that building something meaningful is somehow a form of avoidance. That reading would miss the point entirely. The distinction is not between working hard and not working hard. The distinction is in what's driving the work. There are people who work intensely from genuine engagement, curiosity, creative investment, the pull of something they actually care about. When these people rest, they can rest. When they're still, the stillness doesn't feel threatening. It feels neutral or even good. The work adds to their life. It's generative. And then there are people for whom the work is not generative. It's defensive. They're not building towards something. They're staying ahead of something. And when the work stops, even briefly, what's left doesn't feel like peace. It feels like exposure. These two people can look identical from the outside. Same hours, same apparent drive and discipline. But internally, the experience is completely different. One person is building, the other is hiding. And the one who's hiding is often the one who looks most like they have it all together. If you've stayed with me this far, you already sense what I'm about to say. The stillness isn't empty. There's something in it. And the reason your mind works so hard to stay away from it, the reason busyness feels like oxygen and rest feels like threat, is because some part of you already knows what's waiting there. It's grief. Not necessarily grief in the conventional sense. Not a specific loss, though there may be those too. I mean grief in the broader, quieter sense. The weight of the life you haven't lived. The desires you decided weren't safe to have. The version of yourself that got postponed indefinitely in service of productivity. The things you wanted, not the things that would look good. Not the things that could be justified, but the things you actually wanted before you learned to want strategically. When you stop moving, that material surfaces. Not with drama, not with violence, quietly. The way honest things tend to arrive when the noise finally drops. And for someone who has spent years, sometimes decades, structuring their entire life to avoid exactly this encounter, even a small amount of it can feel like too much. This is why you can't just rest. This is why the weekend feels wrong. This is why the silence reaches for you in a way that productivity never does. Because productivity asks nothing of you except more of the same. But the silence asks the one question you've been running from. Who are you when you're not useful? Here's what sustained avoidance actually does over time. Chronic busyness, the kind driven by fear rather than engagement, doesn't just suppress the default mode network. It atrophies it. The capacity for genuine self-reflection, for emotional processing, for the kind of slow internal work that produces actual self-knowledge. It weakens from disuse, the same way a muscle weakens when it's never loaded. Which means the longer this goes on, the less capable you become of doing the very thing that would help you. And there's a secondary cost that's more visible, though rarely connected to the right cause. Relationships. When you can't be still with yourself, you can't be fully present with anyone else either. Because presence requires the same thing stillness requires. The willingness to stop performing, to stop managing the impression, to let another person see you without the armor of productivity on. And for someone whose sense of self-worth is structurally tied to output, that exposure is terrifying. So the armor stays on, and the relationships stay, in some essential way, at a distance. Successful, busy, respected, alone in a way that's hard to name. This is one of the most common experiences of high-achieving people that almost nobody talks about honestly. Not because it's rare, because it's too close to the bone. Jung's answer to the shadow wasn't suppression. It wasn't indulgence either. It was integration. The work isn't to stop being driven. It isn't to abandon ambition or dismantle everything you've built. The work is to develop enough honest self-knowledge that the driving comes from a place you've chosen, not a wound you've never examined. And practically, this begins with something deceptively simple. You have to practice being still without immediately fixing the discomfort. Not meditation, necessarily, though that's one path. Not therapy, necessarily, though that can accelerate things considerably. The core practice is smaller than either of those. It's learning to sit with the discomfort of unstructured time without immediately reaching for the anesthetic of productivity. When the restlessness comes, and it will come, you stay. You let the discomfort be there. You don't resolve it. You don't optimize your way out of it. You observe it. You ask what it's actually made of. The first few times, this will feel wrong, wasteful, like you're losing ground to people who are still moving. You're not losing ground. You're doing the work that actually matters. The work underneath the work. Because here's what happens on the other side of that discomfort. And I want to be honest that there is an other side. This is not a permanent condition. The stillness stops feeling like a threat, gradually, unevenly, but genuinely. And when it does, something changes in how you work too. The driven quality doesn't disappear, but it shifts. The urgency softens from anxious to intentional. The work you do starts to feel like it's coming from you rather than running ahead of you. You stop optimizing because you're afraid. You start building because you actually want to build. That is a different life, not a less ambitious life. Not a softer or more passive life, a freer one. You've probably been told that the key to success is more discipline, better systems, earlier mornings, tighter routines, and maybe some of that is useful, but none of it touches this, because this isn't a discipline problem. This is a self-knowledge problem. And the only way through it is through the one place most productive people spend their entire lives avoiding: the quiet. Not because the quiet is comfortable. It isn't, at first. But because once living in the quiet, the grief, the unlived desires, the parts of you that got left behind in the rush to achieve, those things are not your enemy. They're the most honest parts of you. And they've been waiting patiently for a very long time.